Well, thank you very much for kicking off this, this meeting. We have 26 minutes, according to our calendar, for questions. Just remember, when you ask a question, we're being taped. Could you state your name first so that we clearly know who is asking a question? But I will start off with a question because it's my prerogative and because I can ask those questions that nobody else cares about. So since I spent most of my clinical life as a primary care internist, the person who was left out of all this communication flow is the person's real doctor. People don't walk around their life having an oncologist. They have a doctor. And when they get enrolled in a trial, if that doctor doesn't know it, understand the trial, understand the potential side effects, when people get side effects that seem to be completely disconnected from the treatment of the trial, they don't go to that trial doctor. They go back to their real doctor. And I have never received a communication from any trial that my patients were enrolled in by a specialist. And I can tell you all kinds of stories about how that creates unbelievable confusion, complications, and mistreatment when people come in and you don't know that. I've also never had a patient hand me a document and say, "This is for you, doctor. I was given a stack of these that if I ever go to see anybody, you need to know this about the trial I'm in." So I'll ask you guys that.
So, so I think that's a great point, and one that we actually addressed as part of the return of results project, in part because by the time some results are available, actually the participant is no longer seeing the investigator, the trial is closed, they're done. And then what do you do with that? Now, there's a whole axis of communication, that's what we called it, because if the sponsor has the result, they actually don't know who the patient is usually. They have a coded, sort of some information that then needs to go to the investigator, and the investigator needs to go and look it up and send it to the provider, unless there was some way that there was an electronic solution to that, and I know that's getting explored. But there are so many pieces of this axis of communication that is problematic. You're absolutely right. It deserves significant study, dissection, analysis, and then figuring out whether there are tools besides a piece of paper that we can work with now and make available, at least, as I say, in the global north, because you're absolutely right. I should also say that there are a lot of trials that are done increasingly now in the quote community, not in academic medical centers with investigators that are not the providers of their patients. That raises a whole other set of ethical and other issues where the investigator is the primary care doctor and motivated to enroll. But putting all of those aside, you're absolutely right. We need a system where there is both communication and knowledge. Now, there's a few exceptions to that. We have certain trials where the participant decides that no one will know other than them that they're participating. That's particularly true in substance use disorders and sort of abuse situations and a number of other problems where it has the condition itself has implications for their job insurance or others. But that's a minor proportion of the number of the significant challenge you're describing. Thank you for bringing that up.
And I would just add that most patients want their doctor to know, and they want to continue to see the person that they've built a relationship with through the years. So I think that the more that we can, this is never a single issue, and when we talk about patients and people, without talking about their healthcare providers and their all of their doctors, right? Because they usually just don't have one. We have to make sure that information is available in both directions there. So.
Questions? Terry.
Terry Davis. I loved this panel, and I have a quick question for Barbara and then a how question for both of you. Does Harvard, those consent forms were so cool with the pictures that y'all had vetted so well. Have they been approved? Are they being used?
So I'm not exactly sure which you mean, the research procedures set of brochures or the actual single consent that I showed briefly?
Yeah, I thought you had this is how it usually looks and this is how we've redesigned it. I want to know if the IRB had approved that.
So Sylvia, that is in use, but go ahead. You have to use your,
My loudest voice possible.
yeah.
So Lori Hall actually sent that to us, and I noticed that there was a credit missing from that slide, but they. Thank you. But yes, that was actually developed by Eli Lilly in partnership with an organization at UC Berkeley, and we actually developed a case study on this. And so it is in use and has been used by others, and I think Lori can probably comment more on that, but we're definitely seeing more of these kinds of products coming out of industry, and I think academia is working to try to keep up and try to integrate that as well, but it's not necessarily been as easy to do.
Partly because it's resource intensive. But, you know, where we find the greatest challenge with the IRBs, at least locally, is not when the written template is redrafted in design and in the inclusion of visuals, but wherein we want to move towards a more electronic sort of set of explanations. So if you want to look at, let's say, an MRI, you can click on MRI, and it brings you to a little video that shows what an MRI is. All of that, they're like, well, how do you know they're clicking? How do you know they're, you know, and it's like, it's okay if they don't click, because right now we don't show them anything anyway. So, you know, getting the IRBs to sort of really understand that we're working on making a bad system better is a challenge. So I'm sorry I interrupted.
Yeah, and for both of you, I get the bi-directional communication and involving people and patients. Can y'all speak to the how-to? The how-to is challenging for me. I'm on a PCORI grant where I'm co-chair of the stakeholder engagement group. And the how best to involve them, how often, what the ask is challenging for me. What are y'all's lessons learned?
Well, I think that's because too often we're thinking about the patient, right? Like it's one person. And there isn't. There's an entire spectrum. There's a spectrum of ages. There's a spectrum of experiences, of cultures, of issues. I think what we need to do is really, and this is where I think the roundtable can help, is we need a better game plan overall of when do we need information, what levels of information, because you've got direct patients who are experiencing this in their own experience, then you have patient advocate groups, and then you have some of us that are like, you know, stayed way too long in this area and understand the strategic level of this for planning and that type of thing. We need all of those different levels of input at different times along the continuum. And it needs to start as early as possible in the development process and then work its way through as concepts and protocols are actually being designed and implemented, directions that can be changed during that period of time, and then for the results. My dream is that we actually are able to use clinical trial results in a way that make our new trials better, right? That we're raising the bar on design of clinical trials so that we get better and better and build impact for the patient communities at the same time as we're creating new drugs and treatments and things like that. So I don't know that answers your question, but it's not a simple answer, and it's not a one-time shot answer. It's over a period of time, and I think we could work on developing a strategy for that.
So I would take a slightly different tack on this and say, I think the question is absolutely right. And that we don't know enough, partly because we haven't studied it enough. And one of the issues is sort of how many patients do you need to do? How many focus groups? Is 4 people in a focus group a focus group? What if what's the diversity of the focus group? How do all of those kinds of things. Generally, what happens is people get comfortable with a certain selected group of participants or potential participants, patients, that are part of the, institutional family and advisory board, patient and family advisory board, or some other group that they have access to that is self-forming, that doesn't necessarily anymore represent the, person in the barber shop, as we say. So, I think we've got a systematic problem now where we're elevating sort of the language without really having done the work to understand what we need to do. What we usually use practically is when revision and review don't have significant changes anymore. So there's no iterative improvement over that, and then send it to a second, sort of discovery and test and see whether the second group has other suggestions. And if they don't have cogent, important suggestions, then we don't. But I think this is something PCORI could take, some time to understand as a methodology itself. And, the question there then would be, what are the outcomes that we'd be looking for, and how do you design that study? And, I can tell you that IRBs, if it's an IRB-approved study rather than, diagnosing it as a quality improvement, and we can have that discussion later, they're very hesitant to embed real randomized trials of things like consent forms or processes within a trial. So that now most of our data, there's a few exceptions, and Neil might want to speak to this later. There are a few exceptions, but almost all of us have used surrogate patients. We sort of take normal people and say, here are 2 consent forms, which do you like better? Not parents of, kids in the NICU who are seizing, and say, okay, which one do you like better? So it's very hard to move an entrenched culture, but that's something that I think would be a real contribution.
Okay, let's move on with other questioners.
My name is Michael McKee. I'm with University of Michigan. Thank you for your talk. I had a couple questions today. So the first one, you mentioned about the educational component before going into the consent process. And I do agree. I work closely with especially deaf and hard of hearing communities, people with disabilities. So they're often at a disadvantage of getting information to the same level that we see with the mainstream population. Could you highlight or provide some examples of what has worked in your communities on the educational part before you get to the consent process? And then the second question I had, we talk a lot about the written materials for the consent phase. What about the audio, video, other components? I think you mentioned a little bit about going to the MRI and watching a brief video, but I'm wondering if you have talked about some of the examples in the past, what's worked, and what might be ideal approaches for all of us.
So first of all, what I'm about to say is not based on good data. So just understand that you're hearing me, not like this has worked and, the following universities have endorsed it. And I'd be interested to hear from Steve Rush later about what education he's done as he's inculcated health literacy through a major corporation, because those kinds of practical examples will teach all of us in academics how to do that kind of thing well. That said, it depends on, in my opinion, what we're asking about. So if you're asking about how do you do an informed consent well, one of the pieces that I think, and we may hear about it from Chris later, is taking the informed consent, annotating the actual document to say, what are the principal points? what do we need to say? What do we need to ask about at the conclusion of that paragraph? What does the participant need to reflect back to us in a teach back kind of model? And having a script. One of the things that, IRBs are allowed to do is to monitor consents. The number of consents monitored by an IRB professional, you could count on one hand. And yet that's their principal oversight responsibility. So, and I have my history, so I can speak with authority on that. So that's one thing. I think that we don't invest enough in making sure that people appreciate that this is a real process and that people are going to understand the first parts of an informed consent initially, and then later different parts are going to be important as the trial proceeds or as their participation proceeds. So I see it as an ongoing responsibility. Many people do not. I do think that you bring up a very important point, which is sort of what do we do about marginalized communities? And that is both issues like the hard of hearing, which frankly I think is easier for us because for the most part, at least in the US and elsewhere, the hard of hearing are literate, so can read and can have the benefit of ASL if we need them. I think it's much harder for the blind. And our tools are much harder, although people can read for them. They can't see what it's going to look like. They can't see what it's going to feel like. So that's a very different experience. I think we have a real challenge in including communities like in rural communities. We spoke recently about sort of the Native American, American Indian folks. We don't do a good job of including them. We don't even know what their issues are. So I think we need to do a really good job now of moving from a stance of protectionism, which is what we've been doing with, quote, vulnerable populations, to one of inclusion, where we really start to try and understand what the safety, efficacy, and effectiveness profile of our interventions are, not just drugs and devices, but our interventions for all of the people we serve.
Okay, next.
So, I'm sorry, can I add one thing to that? I agree with what Barbara said, but I think there's also something else we need to remember, and that's when a person is hearing about research and going through the informed consent process, we have to think about what do those words and what does that process mean from their standpoint. And frankly, patients don't see the informed consent process in the same way that the research community does. We have to sign consents for any kind of medical procedure you get done. And so when someone hears the words informed consent, it's like, okay, well, yeah, one more thing, right? One more procedure, one more whatever. They don't understand the significance of the difference between what we're asking them to do to contribute and participate in research versus whatever treatment or procedure they're there for. And I know in the ethics world, we've had many debates about this, and it's called treatment misconception. And what I keep trying to bring up is it's not the misconception for that person, because especially in cancer trials and things, that is actually their treatment. What we have to do is approach this differently and help them understand the differences between research and treatment so that they can compare, again, give them that context of what would happen to them if they just got regular treatment, what's going to happen to them when they're in research. And I don't think that we do a good enough job with that yet.
Can I just include one more rant while I'm up here?
So,
the other thing that I think we're completely insensitive to, particularly in America where we will soon be minority majority, or majority minority, whatever, I don't remember, is where English is not a first language. And if you find out that somebody is not a native English speaker, you'll see the investigators or the research team talk louder and talk slower. Like, what? And we have no sort of, and in clinical medicine, it's equally difficult. You know, you ask somebody who's Spanish speaking, whose daughter is in the room, and, you know, about a symptom, the woman goes and gives you a 5-paragraph answer, and the daughter says, no. You know, and you're like, well, what else did she say? You know, so we need to have a really thoughtful conversation about what is sufficient translation and how do we make sure somebody has really been sort of informed in a culturally appropriate way, and that we do that in a way that respects their background as well.
Hi, I'm Jay Duig, member of the Roundtable, and I'm with AbbVie's Patient Safety Group. There was actually a great setup because that was my question going on the how. How can we help people understand that difference between research and treatment? So within my group, we'll catalog, we'll analyze all the different safety-related events. And what I'll do is go in and look at the language in the informed consents or the other study documents that are brought to patients and try to make them more plain language. But I was very fortunate that this past fall, and she said that I can use this example, Cindy Shalemsky, who is a patient advocate at My Myeloma Teacher, so on Twitter, said, look, you're talking about, there's some version of, in most study documents, of tell your doctor if you have these side effects or report this back in. She's saying you can make that as health literate as you want, but I understand that if I report in these side effects, you're going to take my treatment away. And now to you, that's what I'm supposed to do. That's your thing. But for me, this is for my cancer. And I'm on this treatment because that's my best shot that I have. And now you're saying if I do what you tell me to do, you're going to take it away. And I know that from her experience and from the other patient advocacy communities. But we know from our side as the clinical investigators, well, that's really important that we learn about those events to get an understanding of the benefits and risks of the drug. So when we go in and continue to talk about health literacy and clinical trials, I keep coming back to that point. Because in the written, in the information, we can get that down, and we're far from it. So like those are the important steps. But how do we address that from that patient standpoint?
That is a major issue. And we hear all the time from patients that, you know, and we know that patients, when they're going to their doctors, try to put their best foot forward, right? And not explain everything that's happening to them. And that's, again, why sometimes having a family member there will be important, because the family member will say, well, that's not true. You're doing this at home and you're doing that at home and things like that. I don't know exactly how to solve that one, except that perhaps there is a way to do a better job of explaining that if they're having these kinds of side effects, maybe they don't go off the drug right away. Maybe they understand that what we want to do is try to help treat those side effects and then see if they can still participate or not. It's different than saying, oh, you're going to be taken off the drug right away. It's again, that expectation and that mindset of the way that we communicate the information, because their safety is critical, absolutely. But there are ways, and there are a lot of clinical trials where they may be taken off their treatment for a while, but might be able to go back on, so.
Yeah, and I would say, I think that's a really good point. I don't think in our informed consent or in our conversations, we do we do a good enough job to set the expectations. Not that, to be explicit about the fact that reporting an adverse event doesn't mean you're coming off the drug, which is, most of the time is true. It's just, there are some that are choices for patients. You know, do you want the neuropathy or do you want to be on the drug? That's their choice, because we know it's, you know, blah, blah, blah. But we don't set that up well. And it's a good, really good point. I also think, you know, it leads me to think about whether we should be starting to explore anonymous reporting in a different way. Because right now, you know, sophisticated patients are using social media in a way that is very different than anything that we've talked about here yet, and certainly impacting their, you know, sort of both the inclusion, exclusion, and their retention on the trial, in both directions, you know. So maybe there's a way we should start thinking about that. Of course, we'd have to evaluate the veracity and integrity of that data, but nevertheless, you'd have it and then could decide what to do with it. You know, our safety systems are not good enough now with patient-reported outcomes. It's the thing we don't do at all well. So I think it's a great point.
Okay, we have 1 minute left. We can either have one question with one short answer, or we can stop now.
Yes, I'm actually acting as a surrogate for my colleague Linda Harris.
Hi. Hi, thanks. I wanted for you all to talk about the role of support groups in helping patients make decisions about their clinical trial experience. Are they friends of those of us who are advocates of health literacy? Are they the enemy? Could they be recruited to be more helpful?
I think that they could be very useful and could be recruited to be more helpful. And as Barbara was saying with social media, I think it's really interesting to me. Many of us learned from the AIDS movement back in the early 90s about how to organize and how to become activists in our own health. And even back then, patients were talking together, right, anyway. And companies now say, oh, we can't have support groups, we can't have an online group of our clinical trial participants because that would bias the study. Well, they're talking anyway. So, you know, why not have some control over the discussion that's there to make sure that it's accurate and useful and constructive, rather than some of the urban myths that come up, like, you know, don't tell your doctor your side effects or you'll be taken off the treatment. You know, that's real in the patient world. Everybody thinks that. So, you know, I think that we can use it, but we have to be thoughtful and really think through what role can they actually play, and then how would we partner with them to do that? Because that means that you also have to address patient issues that clinical trials have not traditionally done.
Okay, Ernestine, you're first next time, or you can come up, but we need to take our break right now. We have a 15-minute break, reconvene at 10:15.